Executive Director of the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council of the Philippines. And I am deeply honored to be invited to speak before you today. In light of this occasion of the APEC 2015 Climate Symposium, let me share the presentation entitled "The Challenge of Managing the New Normal," as it corresponds to the theme of this symposium, that is From Science to Action, on the use of weather and climate information for efficient disaster risk reduction. This presentation will cover the following topics, namely an explanation of the concept of the new normal in the context of the Asia-Pacific region. Second, I will also dwell on the relationship of climate change and disasters with reference to the Global Assessment Report 2015 released by the UNISDR. Third, I will be explaining disaster risk reduction and management in the Philippine context, which will include discussions about the Philippine DRRM system and how we employ the pre-disaster risk assessment. This will also highlight how the use of science and technology applications together with appropriate DRR management intervention helps save and protect lives. The new normal in the Asia-Pacific region. I had the opportunity to chair the recently concluded APEC 2015 9th Senior Disaster Management Officials Forum, or the 9th SDMOF, last September 22 to 23 in Iloilo City. This forum provided a good outlook of what a new normal looks like in the Asia-Pacific region. Allow me to share the following risk information for the region, which were compiled from the presentations during the SDMOF. As we all know, disasters abound in the Asia-Pacific region. In fact, most APEC member economies are situated in the Pacific Ring of Fire, which explains the existence of earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, and landslides. In addition, we also have typhoons and floods. We also experience the El Niño and La Niña phenomena, which are the results of the temperature changes in the Pacific Ocean. These disasters are becoming more complex, frequent, and unpredictable in terms of occurrence, scope, and magnitude. Referred to as the new normal, disasters which used to be a concern of only a few is now the concern of practically everyone. The reality is that disasters as the new normal can no longer be managed single-handedly and in isolation by an economy, a sector, or an organization by itself. According to a study by United Nations Economic and Social Commission for the Asia Pacific, or UNESCAP, entitled Disasters in Asia and the Pacific 2014 Year in Review, the Asia, to include the entire Asian region and the Pacific region, is home to 63 economies with 4.1 billion people, or 75% of the world population. It is also the region with the highest growth rate. This is as of 2014. The region also represents 40% of disaster events and 80% of fatalities. 80%, or about 1.6 billion people affected in 2014, are in this region. The region also bears 50% of the economic damages, amounting to more or less $700 billion from disasters. In 2014, hydromet hazards were also the most frequent, causing most fatalities and economic losses. People in Asia and the Pacific also faces a greater risk of being a victim of disaster impacts. They are twice more vulnerable than those in Africa, 6 times more than those living in Latin American countries, and 30 times more vulnerable than those from the North America and Europe. As per World Bank estimate, the APEC economies have incurred disaster-related losses of over $100 billion every year for the last 10 years. What the figures tells us is that if APEC member economies are not resilient, everything, including production and investments in trade and businesses, may collapse in an instant. It may be too late already for us to realize the importance of addressing this new normal, a phenomenon if our economies are not disaster resilient. At this point, allow me to explain the nexus between climate change, which is the central theme of this symposium, and the disaster from the point of view of disaster risk reduction. According to the Global Assessment Report of 2015, released by UNISDR, through changing temperatures, precipitation, and sea levels, amongst other factors, global climate change is already modifying hazard levels and exacerbating disaster risks. GAR 2015 also points out that in addition to climate change risks, the following factors drives disaster risks to grow into dangerous and unpredictable levels with systematic global impacts: global inequality, increasing hazard exposure, rapid urbanization, and overconsumption of energy and natural capital. The richest 2% of the world's adult population now own over 50% of the global wealth, whereas the bottom 50% own less than 1% of the global wealth. An increasing concentration of wealth, accompanied by depressed real wages and cuts in spending on social welfare and safety nets, is expected to lead to growing risk and inequality. Sectors and territories without comparative advantages for economic development face increasing risks due to low levels of investment in risk-reducing infrastructure. An absence of social and environmental protection and rural and urban poverty, socially segregated urban development in turn generates new patterns of disaster risk. Low-income households are often forced to occupy hazard-exposed areas with low land values, deficient or non-existent infrastructure and social protection, and high levels of environmental degradation. On the other hand, ESCAP study shows inverted resilience, which means that the most exposed economies are also the weakest or most vulnerable. Also, disasters cause an immediate short-term contraction in economic output or even possibly decline in growth. Developing economies can no longer finance response and building back better simply from foreign aid or borrowing. They also have little flexibility in reallocating budget expenditure and face capacity gaps in budgetary and planning processes. APEC economies are also vulnerable as disasters cause disruptions to production and supply chains. They increasingly disrupt the free flow of trade and investment across economies. They present tremendous challenges and serious threats to sustainability and economic growth and development. They lead to serious damages and financial losses. Finally, they result to casualties and claim people's lives. Managing the normal in the Philippine context. Having presented an overview of the risks confronting economies, particularly APEC member economies, let me now provide you a perspective on how the Philippines is addressing this new normal as it affects this country. The geographic location of the Philippines in the Asia-Pacific region explains why it is particularly vulnerable to disaster and climate change risks. It shares these risks with similarly situated countries along the Pacific Typhoon Belt and the Pacific Ring of Fire. As a result, we are visited annually by an average of 20 typhoons, 5 of which are destructive. We are also home to around 300 volcanoes, 22 of which are active. Regular tremors are also felt around the country, many of which are not destructive. Our coastlines are exposed to storm surges, tsunami threats, and creeping sea level rise, among other hazards. Based on the World Risk Report 2014, prepared by the UN's University Institute of Environment and Human Security, the Philippines ranked as second country at risk and third as the most exposed. The Philippines is number 5 among 10 countries most affected from 1994 to 2013, based on the Long-Term Climate Risk Index, or CRI, prepared by German Watch. The Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management System. Having shown the specific vulnerabilities of this country, I will now present an overview of the Philippine DRR system. To strengthen the Philippine stance to address the challenges of the new normal, Republic Act number 10121, or the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010 was enacted on May 27, 2010. A new DRRM framework was developed to serve as a conceptual guide to implement DRRM activities across all sectors, working within the four thematic areas of prevention and mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery and rehabilitation. The framework allows for the all of government and whole of society approach in the pursuit of its vision for a safer, adaptive, and resilient Filipino communities towards sustainable development. The law also allowed for a more robust structure for DRRM in the country under the banner of the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, with the Secretary of National Defense as the chairperson. 4 vice chairpersons are also assigned to lead each of the thematic areas. Yours truly heads the Office of the Civil Defense, which is a member and a secretariat of the Council, while at the same time, I perform the task of as the Executive Director of the Council. The NDRRMC is supported by its network of regional DRRM councils and local DRRM councils from the provinces down to the villages or barangays. The organizational structure replicates that of the NDRRMC for fluidity of program implementation and monitoring. To ensure collective commitment of all stakeholders in pursuing the intent of RA 10121 and the National DRRM Framework, a National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Plan for 2011 to 2028 was approved on February of 2012. The plan outlines programs, projects, and activities covering the 4 distinct yet mutually reinforcing priority areas with 4 long-term goals focused on disaster prevention and mitigation, disaster preparedness, response, and rehabilitation and recovery. These goals are to be achieved by 2028 through 14 objectives, 24 outcomes, 56 outposts, and 93 activities. They are aimed at strengthening the capacity of both national government and local government units, together with stakeholders, to build disaster-resilient communities and to institutionalize arrangements and measures for reducing disaster risk. Now, how do we do it? The Pre-Disaster Risk Assessment or Action Programs and Protocols, or PDRA-APP. The institutionalization into policy or action plans of the Pre-Disaster Risk Assessment, Action Programs and Protocol, or PDRA-APP, will further enhance the DRR mechanism in the Philippines as we move one step ahead of a likely disaster. This is in compliance with Republic Act 10121, particularly Section 2, Item K and L of the law, that states to recognize the local risk pattern across the country and strengthen the capacities of communities and local government units for DRR, specifically on mitigating and preparing for, responding to, and recovering from the impact of disasters. And Section 6 of the law, Item J, which states that to develop assessment tools on the existing and potential hazards and risks brought about by climate change. The Pre-Disaster Risk Assessment Action Programs, or PDRA-APP, was approved by the Council in June 11, 2014, and was institutionalized through a Council Memorandum number 17 dated 18 August 2015. This is an internationally accepted process of evaluating a hazard's level of risk given the degree of exposure and vulnerability in a specific area. The objectives were to have a common understanding, initially at the national level, of how to deal with disasters way before they occur, and subsequently formulate and implement coordinated national and local actions to address impending hazards. It recognizes risk as a product of hazards whose impact on localities can be made worse with the people's vulnerability and exposure, but which can be mitigated through the capacity of the affected communities. It should be noted that the PDRA cuts across all the thematic areas. The PDRA, therefore, is a tool that addresses the possible risks and impacts of impending hazards in a manner that is hazard-specific, area-focused, and time-bound, and not only based on an across-the-board warning signals. PDRA APP cuts across the thematic areas. It is a critical cog in and the prime mover in the system. And the prime mover in the system is what we call the PDRA core group. The core group starts to meet upon the determination of a possibility of a weather anomaly developing and hitting the Philippines. This is led by the Council Secretariat, or the OCD, and composed of the focal persons of the 4 DRRM thematic areas. Department of Science and Technology for Prevention and Mitigation, who provide the forecasting for the hazard. The Department of Interior and Local Government for the area-focused preparedness. The Department of Social Welfare and Development for deliberate planning and timely and appropriate conduct of response actions during and after occurrence of the calamity, and the National Economic Development Authority for the holistic planning and implementation of post-disaster recovery and rehabilitation. PDRA plays an important part into policy formulation and decision-making for both national and local governments, including other stakeholders in the disaster risk reduction. It looks into both historical data and probabilistic scenarios, and mostly concerned with addressing existing risks. The organizational structure supporting the PDRA is shown in the chart. The flow charts shows how PDRA works, particularly for hydromet hazards. During the monitoring phase, DOST Pag-asa operates 24/7 to monitor the weather condition that may affect the country. This includes identifying possible weather anomalies. This information is relayed to its network, including the NDRRMC Operations Center. When a severe weather disturbance enters the Philippine area of responsibility, Pag-asa recommends the convening of the PDRA core group to the Executive Director of the NDRRMC. NDRRMC, through the OCD, issues a notice to convene the members of the PDRA core group, DOST, DILG, DIWD, NEDA, DNR, which to include the Mines and Geosciences Bureau, the NAMRIA, Department of Education, Health, and other response agencies as may be necessary are also called in. The Office of Civil Defense provides primary support for the conduct of all these activities. Pag-asa briefs the PDRA core group on the situation and characteristics of the impending hydromet hazard. They project DOST project NOAA provides information on areas susceptible to storm surges and floodings. Pag-asa also analyzes the variance in the projection of typhoon tracks coming from different meteorological organizations to come up with a consensus track which should be the basis of action for the government. Next slide. The PDRA core group discusses possible scenarios relative to the impending hazard. DNR MGB provides input on the areas at risk to rain-induced landslides and flooding based on the rainfall data provided. NEDA determines the required economic development and planning, including statistical information in areas likely to be affected. To establish area-focused preparedness, Department of Interior and Local Government, and through the local government units, takes the lead in coordination and implementation of local preparedness plan from the national to the local level based on risk assessment. Preparedness will follow the 3 levels of critical preparedness action: conditions Charlie, Bravo, and Alpha. DSWD, through its local social development offices, determines the appropriate level of response, such as prepositioning of relief goods and services. Once the appropriate area, focused preparedness is determined based on the risk assessment, timely issuance of alerts, warnings, and advisories are provided to the public through the NDRMC Communications Network, SMS, fax, email, website, social media, and the media. Based on the agreements during the PDRA, the agencies proceed to implement their respective preparedness action plans and provide situational reports and updates to the NDRRMC through its Operations Center for monitoring and consolidation. PDRA Core Group will be reconvened based upon updated hazard information. Now, the use of science and technology in PDRA. As presented earlier, climate information and related products are an integral part of risk assessments, particularly for PDRA. Hydromet hazards, being slow onset hazards, gives us the opportunity to make ample preparations. The only question is how much lead time is available for these preparations to take place. Fortunately, advances in science and technology makes it possible for longer lead times and more accurate forecasts and projections, which in turn leads to good decision-making for preparedness activities with the end goal of saving lives and opportunity based on risk-informed decisions. The use of satellite imagery, such as shown from the UST Pag-asa and the MSAT, allows for the real-time assessment of the movement, strength, diameter, cloud band, degree of possible rainfall, and severity of a specific weather disturbance. Pag-asa monitors these satellite images, use the same as a basis for its recommendation for the conduct of the pre-disaster risk assessment. Pag-asa also utilizes the forecasts of various meteorological agencies in the Asia-Pacific region to be able to come up with its consensus track. The determination of the consensus track is vital to PDRA since it will be the basis of planned DRRM interventions of mandated government agencies. Shown is the consensus track by Pag-asa on 16 October this year when we were tracking Typhoon Kopu with a 24-hour to 120-hour forecast positions and corresponding tropical cyclone category. Related to the specific forecast, the following public storm warning signals were raised in the said areas. This will be modified as soon as weather updates are made available during the 6-hour interval bulletin. PSWS also shows the corresponding wind strength and impacts giving specific timeframes. The next slide is a sample of an assessment for critical preparedness action for Typhoon Lando or Kopu based on the consensus track. The areas likely to be affected by the typhoon is represented by the hot dog-like figure, where the areas in red, where in alert level Charlie, falls within the 600-kilometer diameter of the typhoon. An area or areas in orange, alert level Bravo, are 50 kilometers away from the Charlie, while areas in yellow or alert level Alpha are 100 kilometers away from Charlie. Based on this information, we have projected that Typhoon Lando will be affecting 8 regions, over 31 provinces, 61 cities, and 577 municipalities of the country. Reports received from the regions 1, 2, 3, 4A, 5, CAR, and NCR in the aftermath of Kopu validated this information. The Global Spectral Model, or GSM, of the 3-day forecast for 24-hour rainfall was also made possible by consolidating and analyzing data gathered from different weather stations and network of rain gauges all over the country. This is the tabular representation of the spatial data presented earlier, which becomes the basis of issuance of area-specific rainfall warnings through our operations center. And taken off from the previous slide, Pag-asa stations with automatic rain gauges show that pre-landfall of the typhoon, the highest amount of rainfall was recorded in Kasiguran, Aurora. As the Typhoon Kopu approaches, we can see which areas will experience varied rainfall intensities within specific time frames. with inputs from the DOST, Project NOAA for possible storm surges, and from the Mines and Geosciences Bureau in identifying the areas prone to rain-induced landslides. The PDRA core group can now make risk-informed decisions in the action plans to be immediately implemented in identified communities. A cursory comparative analysis of the 3 recent significant typhoons to hit the Philippines will show that Typhoon Yolanda remains, or Haiyan, remains the strongest, although the recent Typhoon Hagupit was not very far behind, staying even longer in the Philippine area of responsibility. So far, Typhoon Lando is the strongest severe weather disturbance for this year. On the summary of effects on people, there had been a significant decline from the 60,300 dead and 1,061 missing during Yolanda to Ruby, where there were 18 dead and none missing. And the most recent statistics from Copo, Orlando, as of 6 a.m. Yesterday, showed that there were 48 deaths and 4 still missing. Most fatalities were due to landslides. If given the time, if you are going to look at the rainfall data that we were showing in the table earlier, it would indicate that precisely most of the fatalities were in the areas where the significant rainfall happened and landslides indeed happened. Shown is the comparison in terms of affected regions and damaged houses. Note that these are just some of the data we are collecting as part of our post-disaster needs assessment, or what we sometimes conveniently call as post-disaster forensics. Learning from our experience with Typhoon Yolanda, we have proven, particularly with our experience with Typhoon Ruby and the others that followed up to Typhoon Lando, that enhancing cooperation between the government and the people would yield very positive results in terms of DRRM. The government ensured that the structure, resources, and systems for DRRM are in place, including early warning and logistics for disaster preparedness and response. These efforts are complemented and fully supported by the people. Allow me to point out that for Typhoon Ruby, we have conducted preemptive evacuation for a total of 716,000 plus individuals. This initiative will not be done by the government alone, no matter how prepared it is, without the willingness and cooperation of the people. The same way that the affected people needs its government to provide the needed structure, resources, and systems. Another measure implemented was the utilization of the social media to support the efforts of the Council's response cluster. Our social media accounts were set up for the information exchange and coordination so that the government can facilitate quick response to those in need. Given the government's effort in handling the latest typhoon, Copo, we continue to receive commendation from the international community. It may not be perfect, the system may not have been perfect, but a lot of lessons learned. We get a lot of lessons learned, and these lessons learned that we try to put back into further improving the system. The Philippine government, under the stewardship of the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council, is bound to continue its effort to further enhance our systems and programs for disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. We continue to work with all stakeholders, particularly those in the scientific community, the academe, research institutions, the communities, and other like-minded groups and individuals to pursue our vision of a safer, climate change adaptive, and disaster resilient communities for our people. This ends my presentation. Thank you.